Welcome. For this episode of the Astro Read, I will be presenting solo without Stella, and I will be analyzing Jeffrey Dahmer's chart. So Jeffrey Dahmer has been a big topic of discussion in recent times and definitely this past year with the show based on Dahmer that stars Evan Roberts being super popular on Netflix. I think it's still in the top 10, at least in Canada. So I was curious to analyze his charts, especially now with it being spooky season and with the Taurus Scorpio eclipses wrapping up at least for 2022. And I'll explain why those eclipses are important when it comes to Dahmer later on in this episode. It feels weird to present by myself, but here goes. So for anybody that's watched either the Dahmer tapes or Dahmer, a big question that has come up with Jeffrey Dahmer that he even asked himself was he insane, or was there something just naturally evil within him? And so based on that question, I decided to analyze his chart to see if there were indicators in the natal chart that could perhaps create a perfect storm for what Dahmer's life ended up being. And as a disclaimer, all the analyzations of notable figures and celebrities, they are for entertainment purposes. And, so it's just in this case, my interpretation of Jeffrey Dahmer's chart and how it could apply to his life. And also, as an extra disclaimer, there's no definitive marker in a natal chart of whether somebody would be a serial killer. But I think when it comes to Jeffrey Dahmer, there's different things that I found in his natal chart that really ties to what we ended up learning about him through the show and through the Dahmer tapes and for what people know about him. And it was almost like a perfect, like I mentioned before, a perfect storm, a combination of things that caused we know of Dahmer to be or to have been throughout his life with the murders he committed. We will touch upon certain themes that I noticed in his charts. The first is based on his natal chart. To me, it seemed destined that he would have a tough upbringing, and that's something that we now know of, with his mother having mental health issues and his mother and father always fighting, and then the father having his own issues, whether you agree or not, as to whether he should have shown Jeffrey Dahmer taxidermy at such a young age. And then there's, in the show at least, they bring to light that the father used to have his own fantasies, his own violent fantasies as well. So perhaps that was passed down to Jeffrey, who knows? But with Jeffrey Dahmer's chart, he has Cancer and Capricorn on the 4th and 10th houses of his chart. And the 4th and 10th houses have to do with the mother and father. So the 4th house tends to represent the mother and the 10th house represents the father. And with it having Cancer and Capricorn on those houses, it could mean that he probably had a very strict upbringing, or he probably had a strict upbringing, maybe not the most supportive on an emotional level. Perhaps he was to follow a certain way of being. But then, ironically as well, Jeffrey Dahmer's Ceres, which is an asteroid that represents how one is nurtured, is in the sign of Aquarius, and it's in the 5th house. So with Ceres being in such a freedom-loving, unconventional sign like Aquarius, it could mean that there could be an imbalance if the person with that type of Ceres, which in this case Dahmer had, was given too much freedom, and that can cause trouble. And that definitely happened with Dahmer when he was left by himself at home when he was 17 years old for, I think, a few months while his mom left, and then his father was out of the picture for who knows what reason. I still don't know. And then on top of that, his series has really tough aspects with the sun, Venus, Pluto, and Uranus. So it has 4 tough aspects, which means that would definitely cause challenges with how Dahmer felt he was nurtured, or how he was nurtured, or the lack of nurture he received. On top of that, his Chiron which represents his internal wound, is right next to his Ceres, which means that a lot of his inner wounds would probably have to do with how he was raised and how he was nurtured. With his Ceres challenging aspects, it could cause conflicts between Dahmer being himself and meeting the obligations of family. It could cause a fear of separation from those that he loves, or him experiencing loss of a parent. And so those things definitely came into play with Dahmer. In the show, they pointed out that the father would leave for periods of time for work or for other reasons, and Dahmer wouldn't like it very much, and he would miss his father, and that probably affected him on a really deep level. And even when it came to how Dahmer felt in regards to his victims, a big theme of how he treated his victims related to not wanting them to leave. So he would either do lobotomy type of procedures or ultimately murder to keep those individuals around. So there was definitely a big theme there with Dahmer and having a fear abandonment that was incredibly severe. And perhaps if Dahmer would have gotten help with that at a young age, maybe things would have gone about differently. Who knows? We will never know. And later on in the episode, I'll go over Dahmer's fixed stars that show his fate and how his fate changed along the way from childhood to adulthood. So that's one point there. Dahmer, in my opinion, was destined to have a tough upbringing. But then again, children unfortunately have really tough upbringings and they don't end up being serial killers. So again, with all the other points I'm going to make in this episode, it shows how, unfortunately, with Dahmer, there was just this perfect storm that came about that resulted in him doing the terrible things that he did. Another notable thing about, or actually notable theme about Dahmer, is that there's a lot of presence in his chart that indicate that he's impulsive, lacks emotion, or lacks being able to have emotions for others, and could have a controlling nature. So the first thing is that Dahmer's weakest element in his natal chart is water. I think he only has one planet in that sign. And water is the element that corresponds with sensitivity. And so, with water being the weakest element, you would have to hope that there's other indicators in the chart that can compensate for that lack of element. So maybe certain planetary placements that would allow somebody to have more sensitivity. But in Dahmer's case, unfortunately, it's almost like there's more things present in the chart that support a lack of emotion or a lack of sympathy. As well, Dahmer has no oppositions between planets in his natal chart. So that means none of the planets oppose each other in the natal chart. And so when somebody doesn't have oppositions in their chart, or has a lack of oppositions in their chart between planets, it could mean that they have a hard time relating to others. And usually people with this tendency have to learn how to relate to others through the hard way, through experience. I think this showed in Dahmer's life where he felt isolated from others. So on top of that, he probably wasn't able to relate to others as well, probably couldn't sympathize with other people's suffering as long as he was meeting his own needs. Then on top of that, Dahmer's moon, which is the planet of emotion, and Mars, which is the planet of action, are both in the very impulsive sign of Aries. So in other episodes, you've probably heard about my caution or dislike or bugaboo, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to the moon in Aries. But this is the first chart I've seen, I think, where somebody has the moon and Mars in Aries. So that's really going to create double the impact when it comes to being self-centered, being emotionally detached, perhaps even being aggressive, being impulsive. So it's a very challenging combination of planetary placements to have. And it goes along with how Dahmer has been portrayed, where he committed these murders, especially the first two that he committed, seemed very impulsive in nature. And then after that, he somehow got the sense that he can get away with these things, and then he just ended up doing more murders. So yeah, with the moon and Mars in Aries, it really correlates to somebody that's very impulsive and thinks about themselves first before they can think of others. So again, going with that theme of being impulsive, self-centered, unemotional. And he also has a pretty tough Uranus placement as far as what sign it is in. So Uranus is the planet of being unconventional. It's the planet of the unexpected, and it's in the very showy type of sign of Leo. Leo represents childlike behavior, childlike innocence. It also represents being in the spotlight. It represents love. Leo can be somewhat of a self-centered sign as well, just like Aries is. With Uranus being in Leo, it could lead, in worst case scenario, to manifest as destructive tendencies when somebody has it in low vibration. And then as well, Dahmer has one tough sun placement in particular, sun square Pluto. And so sun is the planet of individuality. Pluto is the planet of various things, but can be considered the planet of destruction. And so you've got the sun, individuality in a challenging aspect with the planet of destruction and what's underneath. And so that can manifest as somebody having trouble harnessing their energy and perhaps being temperamental and not knowing how to compromise. So again, adding to the controlling, egocentric nature that Dahmer likely could have had. And then as well, his moon has a tough aspect with his ascendant. So again, leading to a possible temperamental nature and having a hard time managing emotions. Yep. So that's one of the themes. Dahmer having indicators in the chart that show impulsivity. And that came into play with the murders, at least how it's been interpreted by the show. And then another factor, and what made Dahmer such an interesting figure to the public, is that Dahmer created horrific murders, obviously was sinister, not well, but then his outer appearance was very attractive to many people. I think even to myself as well, looking at him, it's very jarring because I think there's a stereotype of if somebody is a murderer, they are going to look unattractive or conventionally unattractive or look kind of creepy. But Dahmer looked like the guy you would see next door, like the guy on the football team. And that's probably what allowed him to get away with connecting with the individuals that unfortunately became his victims. The fact that he probably seemed very non-threatening when approaching these men and was attractive and would attract others. And so Dahmer's natal chart shows several indicators that he would be attractive. So his Venus, the planet of love, Venus can also represent beauty. It's in a good sign. So basically Venus is in Taurus and Taurus is ruled by Venus. So Venus is in a really good place in his chart, which can indicate being good looking. Dahmer's ascendant is Libra, and Libra is the sign of beauty. So again, adding to that outward appearance of beauty, the ascendant represents the first impression that you would give to another person. And so with Dahmer's ascendant being a Libra, it would indicate somebody that would give a good looking first impression. Then as well, Dahmer's sun is right next to his Venus. So sun, the planet of identity, right next to Venus, the planet of beauty. So again, adding to the identity being associated with good looks when it comes to Dahmer. And so, yeah, those are some of the indicators that I'll point out that show that whoever would have this chart being Dahmer would be somebody that is likely or was likely to be very attractive and able to attract others. And then on top of that, Dahmer's sun is in the 8th house. And that would also indicate somebody that could attract others and get support from others. And we definitely saw that in the show where even though Dahmer's a serial killer and committed all these crimes, he had so many adoring fans. So yeah, there's lots of indicators in Dahmer's natal chart that would show that he would attract others. So it's adding to that jarring complexity of Dahmer where the outside doesn't really meet or doesn't really correspond with what one would expect from the inside. And then another theme that I noticed with Dahmer's chart is there's indicators in his natal chart that show that he really desired connection, but at the same time, ironically, had issues with connecting with others. As I mentioned before, Dahmer has no opposition aspects between planets in his chart, which will indicate that he likely had a hard time relating to others. But then there's indicators in his chart that show that he would want to connect with people. And in my opinion, I think there are two major things that ideally should have been addressed in Dahmer's childhood that hopefully would have created a better outcome for him. One being in an alternate reality, I wish Dahmer would have gotten therapy as a kid to deal with abandonment issues, because they seemed very severe when it came to him, and it shows very severe fears of abandonment in his chart. And then two, I wish Dahmer would have gotten support with how to connect with others, because that would have maybe helped him have healthier connections. So as I mentioned before, Dahmer's ascendant is in Libra, so that could make him charming and good looking, but also wanting companionship, because Libra is the sign of relationships. So that could mean wanting a relationship, a romantic relationship, or just wanting to be connected to others. Then on top of that, Dahmer's 11th house, which the 11th house represents social network and friendships, that has the sign of Leo on it. And Leo is a sign of wanting attention. And so with that connected with the house of friendship, it could lead to somebody that would want friendships and want attention and want connection. But then Dahmer's Saturn has really tough aspects and a tough placement. So Dahmer's Saturn is in Capricorn, which Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. So Saturn is in the sign it knows the most, or the sign it feels at home in Dahmer's chart, with it being in Capricorn. But Saturn in Capricorn could manifest as somebody having more of a detached demeanor, somebody that could worry a lot, somebody that could be insecure. Then on top of that, Dahmer's Saturn is in his third house, and the third house represents thought and communication. So with Saturn, the worrywart planet, being in that house, it could lead to somebody that perhaps is not comfortable with or double thinks how they think. It could manifest as somebody that is critical of how they think and how they communicate. And in my opinion, I think that manifested or was shown when Dahmer would point out or think that there was something wrong with him, which clearly there was. But I think those thoughts that Dahmer had of something innately being wrong with him probably stemmed from childhood. It was probably something he always had. And there's a difference between knowing that committing murders is wrong and repenting that, and there's a difference between that and what Dahmer was doing, which is pretty much him thinking that there was just something innately wrong with him from birth, without even thinking about, was it my upbringing? Was it certain fears that weren't addressed? It wasn't necessarily that, or it didn't seem that way to me. It was more like Dahmer just thought there was something just wrong with him, just right off the bat, no cure, something wrong with him, or at least that was my impression. And that to me gives me Saturn in third house vibe. Saturn is also in challenging aspect with Dahmer's ascendant, which could also lead to being self-critical. His moon, the planet of emotion, is in challenging aspect to his Saturn. Dahmer's moon, which is the planet of emotion, is in challenging aspect with Saturn. And so that could lead to being critical over your emotions, could lead to depression, it could lead to clinging to the past. And then as well, Dahmer's Pluto, which could be considered the planet of destruction, is in his 11th house of friendships. So that's a dichotomy there. So you've got in Dahmer's chart, Leo, the sign of attention, on the 11th house of friendship. But then you also have Pluto, the sign of inner fear, inner wounds, and destruction, also in the 11th house of friendship. So that right there really symbolizes to me somebody that desires connection, but also has fears around it, also has hiccups about it, for lack of a better word. And yeah, that's really unfortunate and sad when I think about it. That struggle that Dahmer had growing up and even as adult, where he desired connection, but somehow couldn't get around to doing it at all, or doing it in a way that was healthy or normal. Then, as well, adding to the list of things that go along with my theme for Dahmer of desire for connection, but challenges with it, is that Mercury, the sign of thinking and communication, is in challenging aspect with Pluto, the sign of inner turmoil, the sign of destruction. And so that could lead to somebody that may be unstable with how they think and or communicate. And then Dahmer's Vesta, which Vesta is the asteroid that represents focus, but Vesta can also represent sexual nature as well. And his Vesta is in the sign of Capricorn in the 3rd house. And his Vesta is actually very close to his Saturn, which, as I mentioned already, his Saturn is very challenged. And I think that kind of influence also leads to Dahmer's Vesta being challenged as well. So with somebody that has a challenging placement of their Vesta, especially with it being in Capricorn in the 3rd house, that could manifest as having a fear of sexual intimacy or being self-critical when it comes to their sexuality. As well, Dahmer's moon is in challenging aspect with his Vesta. So that could also lead to a fear of intimacy or feeling conflicted between the expectations of family. So with the moon being in challenging aspect with Vesta, it could manifest as somebody that has to balance the expectations of family with sexual tendencies, somebody that could have a fear of intimacy, and that could have come into play with Dahmer. Dahmer said that he was homosexual. He did have relations with men, and it wasn't made super clear in the show, but I think the impression that was given that his family probably wouldn't have accepted Dahmer being gay or homosexual or however you want to term it. And that also, when you have that pressure, as well as having a lot of self-criticism, as well as having a tough upbringing, that can really lead to a lot of inner turmoil that could manifest in different ways. Again, it doesn't always have to manifest in somebody being a serial killer, but the themes that I'm pointing out show that things were just stacked against Dahmer from a natal chart perspective. And he was probably somebody that if I saw his natal chart as a kid, I probably would have recommended that he had gotten a lot of support, emotional support, psychological support, probably more support than unfortunately Dahmer ended up receiving in his life, in his youth. And then to add to the theme of desire for connection, but challenges with it, is Virgo being on Dahmer's 12th house. So Virgo can be a very nitpicky sign, a perfectionist kind of sign, always wanting continuous improvement type of sign. And the 12th house represents the subconscious and what's hidden. So that could lead to somebody being very nitpicky about their own subconscious or having a hard time accepting themselves. And then, as I mentioned before, Dahmer's Chiron, which represents his inner wound, is next to his Ceres, which is the asteroid that represents how one is nurtured. And like I mentioned before, Dahmer could have had inner wounds in regards to and in relation to how he was raised, how he was nurtured. Dahmer's Chiron is in the sign of Pisces in the 5th house. So that can manifest as having a lack of faith in general, a lack of faith in life, feeling like a victim, feeling like everything's stacked against you, lacking trust in others, or lacking trust in yourself. It could manifest as lacking trust in oneself and being able to express your true gifts. And with Dahmer's time in prison, I think he probably started to heal his Chiron wound, and that came about when Dahmer started to become more religious and decided to get baptized. For me, that connected with his Chiron in Pisces, because probably before he felt like life was just stacked against him, or he probably feared betrayal, feared abandonment. But then through his time in prison and through his time reflecting on all the horrible things he did, he was able to have more faith in the divine. So it's almost like this healing of this wound happened a little late, but maybe not late. Maybe late is better than never, but it would have been better if Dahmer would have had support in healing that wound and the multiple wounds he has in his natal chart before he actually ended up committing the horrible murders that he committed. So the next theme with Dahmer that I want to point out is his attraction to the spiritual. So one of the things that's mentioned in the Dahmer show, what we see in the Dahmer show is Dahmer becoming more religious in prison, deciding to get baptized. And I think some people would naturally think, okay, was that real? Was there pure intentions with that? Was he doing it for show? And I think I would say no, in my opinion, just based on Dahmer's Chiron in Pisces, as well as multiple indicators in Dahmer's chart that show an attraction to spirituality and also a capacity for morality, ironically enough. Dahmer's Jupiter is in Capricorn, and it's in the 3rd house. And Jupiter is a planet of expansion, but it is also a planet of philosophical thought. And with it being in Capricorn and in the 3rd house, for Dahmer, could have manifested as his philosophical thought being more traditional in nature, because Capricorn is a more traditional sign, but it could also lead to a lot of Dahmer's thought process relating to a higher philosophy or being philosophical in thought, because the 3rd house represents thought and communication. So it's just ironic that Dahmer has this capacity for high morals, but committed all these horrible acts. And again, I think that's just an instance of the noble part of his charts in conflict with all the challenging aspects that he had stacked up in his chart. And also the fact that perhaps Dahmer had traditional views that did not go along with who he really was at his core. For example, I think Dahmer's chart indicates that he probably had a traditional upbringing, an upbringing that probably wouldn't have accepted his sexuality. But on top of that, I think Dahmer probably didn't accept his sexuality and had a hard time coming to terms with it in an individual level because of his innate traditional views. And so that unfortunately manifested in negative ways when it comes to the horrible things that Dahmer ended up doing. And then unfortunately, Dahmer's Jupiter might have been placed well, but had a very challenging aspect with it being square his Mars. So again, another instance of a good component to Dahmer's chart, but then combated by a challenging component to his natal chart that ended up winning out in the end. But then when it comes to Dahmer's potential attraction to the spiritual, what I go to in the natal chart is the strong influence that the 8th house has in his natal chart. Dahmer has his Sun, his Mercury, and his Venus in the 8th house. So the planet of individuality, the planet of thought and communication, and the planet of love, all in the 8th house. And the 8th house represents various things. But one of the things it represents is the mystical topics. It represents psychology. It represents psychic ability. And so with 3 planets being in that, it could lead to somebody that really has a focus on those topics. Also, with Dahmer having Jupiter in his 3rd house, that can make him very intuitive. With his moon being in good aspect with Uranus, the planet of emotion and inner sense, which is the moon, being in good aspect with the planet of unconventionality, that could lead to having an interest in spirituality and mystical topics, as well as Jupiter being in good aspect with Neptune could also lead to an interest in mystical topics. On top of that, Dahmer had a grand Earth trine in his natal chart. So a grand Earth trine is when you have three planets or three celestial bodies in trine with each other. And basically these three components make a triangle in the natal chart. So with Dahmer, his Venus, his North Node, and his Saturn form this triangle, and they are each in earth signs, with Venus being in Taurus, the North Node being in Virgo, and Saturn being in Capricorn, creating a grand earth trine. Those with a grand earth trine could have intuitive abilities and could see reality in different ways and could probably be in tune with the earth in different ways. I think there's multiple parts of Dahmer's chart that show that he probably didn't see the world in the same way as the average person. He probably had high psychic ability, which is crazy to think. And instead of that being nurtured, because in everyday society, it's hard, psychic ability isn't really recognized, isn't really nurtured. If somebody sees things differently, they're left to their own devices, in my opinion, in life. And definitely probably was the case in the 70s and 80s when Dahmer was growing up and reaching adulthood. If Dahmer would have had an astrologer helping him out or a psychologist really working with him, it'd be interesting to see what he would have been if not a serial killer. Perhaps he was meant to be this like psychic genius that unfortunately lost his way. We'll never know. So he has a grand earth trine, and his grand earth trine also is part of another configuration that he has, which is a kite. A kite is when you have a grand trine that's attached to a planet that opposes the top of that grand trine. So it's like a triangle and then a planet that opposes a part of the trine, creating a kite. You've got the triangle and then you've got the line at the bottom. So Dahmer's midheaven in Cancer ends up being the kite configuration with the planets that make up the grand trine. So you've got Venus in Taurus, North Node in Virgo, Saturn in Capricorn. They make the grand trine, they make the triangle. And then you've got Cancer, and then you've got, so you've got Venus in Taurus, North Node in Virgo, Saturn in Capricorn, all making the triangle, aka the grand trine. And then you've got the midheaven in Cancer opposing the Saturn to create the bottom part of the kite. So with the kite configuration, the part that opposes the grand trine ends up being the focal point. So in this case, the midheaven in Cancer. And it's very interesting that Dahmer has the midheaven in Cancer. The midheaven is a point in the natal chart that represents how one ideally could contribute to society. It could represent someone's ideal career. And so with a midheaven in Cancer, an ideal career for Dahmer could have been maybe working with women or being in some kind of career that's nurturing, like maybe being a nurse, being in the medical field, or even being in a career that could relate to psychic or intuitive abilities. So it'd be interesting to see what Dahmer could have done with his career if his life would have gone differently. But the midheaven in Cancer to me also gives an extra indicator for me of Dahmer's ability to be connected to spirit and being spiritual. And unfortunately, people didn't get to see that from Dahmer until towards the end of his life. And then as well, which is interesting, is that Dahmer's Pallas Athene, and Pallas Athene is the asteroid of wisdom and creativity. Dahmer's Pallas Athene is in the sign of Capricorn in the 4th house. So with Pallas Athene being in a Capricorn, with Capricorn being the sign of structure, it could mean that Dahmer's wisdom and creativity could have been associated with structural elements, whether it's a skeleton, whether it's a structural foundation. Ironically and sadly, I think that wisdom and creativity ended up playing a role in the murders that he committed. But if he would have perhaps gotten more support to integrate in society in healthy ways, perhaps he could have used that passion that he had for anatomy and the skeleton to do something maybe in the medical field or something else, or be like a medical illustrator, perhaps, instead of doing the things that he did. with Palacephine being in the fourth house, and the fourth house being an intuitive type of house, that could add to Dahmer having psychic abilities as well as Dahmer having his south node in Pisces. It could mean that his soul comfort zone is tuning into his psychic ability. Yeah, that you may or may not agree with, but in my opinion, there's a lot of indicators in his chart that show that he's really in tune to spirit or had the potential to do, and it seems like Dahmer started to reach that ability or start to recognize it towards the end of his life when he was already in prison. The next themes that I'm going to cover are really going to align with and going to add to the conversation of what could Dahmer possibly have done with his life? What was he meant to do with his life potentially? And also his fates. And by his fates, I'm really going to touch upon his fixed stars. Fixed stars show what somebody could be fated to do. Free will does play a huge role in life. So just because you're fated to do something based on your fixed stars in your natal chart doesn't mean you're going to actually live up to that fateful expectation, so to speak, because free will does come into play. But I have really found it interesting and fascinating to look at people's fixed stars in their natal chart, because it really gives an indication of what somebody could be destined to do, and it can give people a lot of direction. So I think one of the most, if not the most interesting thing in Dahmer's natal chart is his yod configuration. So a yod is when three planets or three celestial bodies in the natal chart create a Y shape, where you have two planets in sextile and then each of those planets in conjunct with a third planet. So basically you've got three planets or celestial parts of the chart making a Y shape. So Dahmer has a yod that includes his Mercury in Gemini, his Mars in Aries, and his Neptune in Scorpio. The focal point of his yod, the bottom of the Y, is his Neptune in Scorpio. And to me, I think that's a really mystical placement. It could be a very dark placement. Neptune is a planet of mystical, in my opinion. It's a planet that represents creativity. It represents artistry. It represents the things unseen. Neptune represents illusion as well. And then he has that in the sign of Scorpio, which is a very investigative sign, also a psychic related type of sign. So that was another indicator to me of Dahmer's potential psychic or intuitive or investigative ability. But Neptune in Scorpio is not a placement for the faint of heart, in my opinion. I think it takes a lot of evolution to be able to wield a Neptune in Scorpio placement well. And so Neptune in Scorpio at its best, at its most evolved, could manifest in somebody that perhaps really tunes into their psychic abilities to help others or to help themselves, or really delves into their psychosis or psychological tendencies. But a lesser evolved Neptune in Scorpio could lead, in my opinion, to somebody that's very disillusioned and lives in their own fantasy and could be consumed by their own darkness. So not an easy placement to have. And with it being the center point of a yod, it means that Dahmer was likely compelled to exude the characteristics of his Neptune and Scorpio placement. So whenever somebody has a yod, it means that they have a life mission that they are compelled to pursue. So either they will feel an inner yearning to pursue that life mission, or life will configure or happen in such a way where it forces you to achieve this life mission. So life probably configured itself in a way for Dahmer to act out on his Neptune and Scorpio tendencies. And then on the sides of the yod, you've got Mars in Aries, which is super impulsive, and you've got Mercury in Gemini, which is like the charming, sweet talker. It's so interesting and sad. Mars is in its ruling sign of Aries. Mercury is in its ruling sign of Gemini. Basically, Mars and Mercury are like in tip-top shape. And then they're basically the teammates or the co-conspirators of his Neptune in Scorpio being able to do what it was compelled to do. And so having this kind of yod could manifest in different ways. And unfortunately, I think it manifested in Dahmer being able to have this successful ability of being able to use his impulsivity and desire and use his ability to charm others to do really dark things. And so the crux of what Dahmer has done or did shows in his yod. And yeah, it could have gone either way. The yod in Dahmer's chart is a huge sword to wield. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to utilize that power and compulsion in a way that was healthy or moral or good. So yeah, I think the yod in Dahmer's chart is the most interesting part of his natal chart. And to me is the biggest source of why he did or was compelled to do the dark things that he did. If Dahmer had a spiritual advisor, let's say, perhaps he would have been able to wield this yod in a different way, where he could have used it to be more spiritual or be more in tune to himself or to face his shadow side. But all these indicators in his chart and in his life created this perfect storm that led him to do really horrible things. I think what also added to the challenge of it being able to manifest in a healthy way in Dahmer's life is that Dahmer's Neptune was afflicted, meaning in his case, his Neptune is retrograde in his chart. So his Neptune is already at a weak capacity in a very intense sign of Scorpio, being supported in this yod by a really strong Mars in Aries and a really strong Mercury in Gemini. So that in a nutshell is Dahmer as the serial killer. Impulse and desire and good, charming communication skills, supporting a really afflicted, illusionary Neptune in a really tough, potentially dark sign of Scorpio. That's Dahmer in a nutshell as a serial killer. And there's aspects I want to point out when it comes to this yod. Like I mentioned, Mercury and Mars are sextile to each other. So that creates the top of the Y. And somebody with Mercury in good aspect with Mars could be somebody that can use their thought process to detect somebody else's weaknesses and take advantage of it. And that's probably what Dahmer did as he chose his victims. He chose people that wouldn't be missed as much, chose people that maybe wouldn't be as believed, chose people that were already at the wrong place at the wrong time, or were perhaps too trusting. But either way, with his Mercury sextile Mars, he had this ability to be able to pinpoint who would be weak, quote unquote, and to take advantage of that person to unfortunately be his victim. So I would say that's the most notable aspect of that yod. And the interesting thing is with a yod, the part of the chart that is opposite the focal point, so in this case, the part of Dahmer's chart that's opposite his Neptune, could create balancing act or support for the yod. And in this case, that opposite side is in his 7th house. So in my opinion, I think if Dahmer would have had the ability to have more supportive and healthy relationships, maybe that would have helped in him being able to utilize his yod in a way that could have been more healthy instead of however he utilized it, which in my opinion was his murders. Then the last point I'll cover is the fixed stars in Dahmer's chart. And as I look through the fixed stars, to me, it showed this story of a child that started with a great gift that was unique and ended up being fated to have an adulthood that was filled with destruction and misfortune. And that's why fixed stars are so important to look at, because they show what somebody's potential fate could be. But ultimately, free will does play a role. You have to put in the free will to have this fate happen in however way it happens. But with Dahmer, 2 of the fixed stars in his chart are close to his ascendant, which is Spica. I think that's how you pronounce it. Spica represents somebody that has a gift that's out of the ordinary. And then Arcturus is a fixed star that represents being a visionary and living life in a way that's different. And any fixed stars that are close to the ascendant would likely manifest early in life. So that could mean Dahmer as a young child probably felt different, likely had a gift that could have been cultivated, but wasn't for whatever reason. At least I don't think so, based on the show and whatever I know of Dahmer. So Dahmer started his life, according to the fixed stars, having all this potential, but unique potential, potential that likely would have been misunderstood. He has two fixed stars on his midheaven. Fixed stars close to the midheaven will manifest in adulthood. So the two fixed stars that are close to the midheaven are Castor and I'll probably list the fixed stars in the episode description because they're hard to pronounce. But so Castor is the star of misfortune, and Procyon is a star that relates to being able to rise, but then not sustain something, basically having a quick rise with no substance. And so these are the stars that influenced Dahmer's adulthood. So we see this trend of his childhood being marked by stars that show great unique potential, and then his adulthood having stars that represent misfortune. And then there are two stars that show up close to his descendant, again having an influence for his adulthood, one of which is Alderamin and the other Alpheratz. And so Alderamin represents aggression, actions that are outside of the laws of nature. It could also represent having balanced energy, the balanced male and female energy. But unfortunately, I think with all the afflictions or all the challenges in Dahmer's natal chart, he probably wouldn't have been able to achieve the good interpretation of Alderamin. He probably ended up exhibiting the negative aspects of that fixed star with being destructive and aggressive. And then Alpheratz represent being able to have freedom. And so that probably manifested in his adulthood, having bad luck, not being able to sustain things, wanting to be free, but also having aggressive, destructive tendencies. And then there's two fixed stars that are close to Dahmer's IC, which is basically the point opposite of the midheaven. And fixed stars that are associated with that part of the chart usually don't manifest or take place until somebody is in their old age or after their death. So in this case, Dahmer didn't really live to old age. So these would be fixed stars that would have an influence now after Dahmer's life had ended. And so there are two fixed stars that are close to the IC, and that is Rukbat and Peacock. So Rukbat represents stubbornness, consistency. Peacock represents love of display and vanity. So I guess the peacock in particular, unfortunately, or I don't know, however you want to look at it, plays a role now. Dahmer is known now more than ever, years after his death. He was murdered in prison in the 90s, in 1994. It's been over 20 years at this point, and Dahmer is still remembered, and not only remembered, but a big point of discussion over 20 years from his death. And so that to me really shows that manifestation of the peacock fixed star, having that star quality even after death. And so why are people so curious about Dahmer now after all these years? Why were the Dahmer tapes created recently? Why was the Dahmer show, well, it's not called the Dahmer show, Dahmer, why was that show created? And why is it so popular? And it's almost like history repeating itself. And the curious thing is that since late 2021, we as a society have been in the Taurus Scorpio eclipses. So they started in November 2021, and these eclipses will end in October 2023, I believe. And the interesting thing is that Dahmer ended up getting baptized during a solar eclipse. If you watch the Dahmer tapes, you probably remember the priest mentioning this, that the baptism happened on a solar eclipse. And so I looked this up, and the solar eclipse that the priest is talking about is the solar eclipse in Taurus that happened on May 10th, 1994. So a solar eclipse is like a more powerful new moon, and it could represent something being initiated, but you don't have all the information yet. And interestingly enough, this solar eclipse in Taurus that happened on May 10th, 1994, on the day Dahmer was baptized, this solar eclipse landed in Dahmer's eighth house in his natal chart. And the eighth house represents represents mystical topics, it represents inner psychology, it also represents death. So there was something about this baptism that ended up being like I wouldn't say an igniter, but almost like a flipping of the switch of something in Dahmer. It was like a start for him, but it was also almost like the beginning of the ends. And then with every solar eclipse, there's the associated lunar eclipse. The solar eclipse was May 10th, 1994 in Taurus. And then there was a lunar eclipse on November 18th, 1994, and that was also in Taurus. And it also fell in Dahmer's eighth house. And Dahmer ended up being killed in prison 10 days after that lunar eclipse. So lunar eclipses can bring a finality, like an ending that happens unexpectedly. And this lunar eclipse happened in Dahmer's eighth house, which could represent death. And coincidentally, he ended up dying 10 days after that lunar eclipse. So it was almost like this baptism. I don't know whether he knew it or not, but it was like the beginning of his death. It was almost like he wanted to be baptized before he died. It's almost like he knew. It was suspected in the Dahmer tapes. The people that knew him, the lawyer, they were all worried about him going out into the general public in the prison because they figured that he would get attacked because there was so much animosity and hatred for all the crimes, all the murders that he committed. So it's almost like by him being baptized, he knew that it was the beginning of the end. And it was almost like he was just so wanting to be connected to people that he was willing to put his life at risk to be connected to others. Or maybe he probably knew it was time for his life to end in some way. And he figured if it happened, and he was just going to let it happen. But it's interesting that Dahmer's final months happened during the eclipse series in Taurus and Scorpio, in this case in Taurus. These solar and lunar eclipses that happened in 1994 probably were associated with the Scorpio ones happening in other months of 1994. And we're once again in the series of eclipses that started in 2021 and will last until 2023. So a lot of the same themes are coming up, us getting a sense of what keeps us rooted when it comes to the Taurus influences, and then also our shadow side, which relates to what Scorpio brings about in us. And maybe that's why we as a society are reviewing and reintroducing ourselves to Dahmer. It could be because we as a society are looking to him or getting entertained by his story, or looking at his story as an opportunity for us to not only answer the question of, was it nature or nurture when it came to Dahmer and the horrible things he did, but also looking to ourselves to see and to think about, is it nature or nurture when it comes to our own shadow sides? And so that could be what's coming into play with Dahmer having this resurgence. So I will end it with that. We didn't talk about Dahmer's Saturn return. And I think when his murders really took off related to his Saturn return. That's another topic as well, but I feel like I ended things on a good ending note that I will leave it here for this episode. So this is a somber episode, but there's been so many conversations, so many videos I've seen about Dahmer that I just felt like analyzing his chart for myself. And yeah, and it ended up sadly being as sad as I would expect from a chart of Dahmer. And whether you believe in astrology or not, natal charts really can tell a lot about a person and about the deeper things that we may see or not see when it comes to somebody. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Stella and I will be back with more episodes coming up. Definitely a lot of celeb astrology episodes and other self-help episodes that will get you prepared for the rest of this year and beyond. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was an interesting one for me to do, but a dark one for me to do, analyzing a serial killer. But it shows what happens when there's a perfect storm between lack of nurture and a tricky nature, and how that can manifest in somebody. And again, that doesn't mean that everybody that has these challenges is going to be a serial killer, but it does mean that when somebody becomes a serial killer, it doesn't happen out of nowhere. It really does take nature and nurture, or maybe you disagree. But anyways, thanks for listening, and Stella and I will see you in the next episode.